Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. Whenever a government official or politician proposes a big government program that will require government funding, such as the Green New Deal or Medicare for All, it is often shot down by people who question where the money is going to come from to pay for it. However, as Stephanie Kelton explains in The Deficit Myth, finding a way to fund these services isn't as impossible as these naysayers claim. The modern monetary theory is a modern, more dynamic economic approach that shifts the focus away from balancing budgets and reducing the budget deficit, and instead focuses on prioritizing the allocation of material resources to boost the economy. This approach can empower the government to implement policies that will address important real-world issues like unemployment, healthcare, and climate change. The TABS model versus the STAB model. People often view federal government spending the same way they view their household spending, and therefore their understanding of the federal budget mirrors the way they understand managing their household budget. Because people understand the concept of planning out their family's finances and sticking to a budget, they assume the government has to plan and manage their finances the same way. However, the federal government is not a family. They do not have to save up or borrow money in order to purchase something. In fact, it is the opposite. According to the modern monetary theory, ordinary families work for and then spend their money, while the federal government actually makes the money. The TABS model, or the tax and borrowing precede spending model, states that the government must earn money, either through taxes or borrowing, before it can buy something, like healthcare, for example. This is similar to the way one would expect a family to pay for something for their household, in which they have to earn the money they want to spend through work or borrow it from someone else. However, in the United States, as in many other countries, the government is the entity responsible for issuing bills and making money. The Federal Reserve is responsible for printing money, and therefore has a monopoly over the monetary supply. As a result, the government does not have to earn money, it can simply make it when it wants to purchase something. Therefore, instead of using the TABS model, governments should be using the STAB model, which stands for spending before taxing and borrowing. The government is responsible for putting money into circulation, so they must make it before it can be taxed and borrowed. Because the federal government has the power to issue currency, they are never at risk of going broke, and they are not held to the same financial constraints as an ordinary family. It does not make sense for the federal government to manage its budget the same way one would expect a family to manage their budget. However, the federal government cannot print as much money as they want, because that leads to inflation. Deficit spending and inflation. Many fiscally conservative politicians are concerned about government spending because they want to avoid a deficit. They view spending more money than the government has as irresponsible. Republicans generally want to reduce the deficit by spending less, while Democrats generally want to reduce the deficit by raising taxes to make up the money spent. The traditional economic model states that the government should strive to maintain a balanced budget and keep their spending under the amount of money they make from taxes. However, according to the modern monetary theory, the goal of maintaining a perfectly balanced federal budget is outdated. The goal of government spending should not be to have a balanced budget. Rather, the goal of government spending should be to create balanced economies. Because the government does not have to worry about going broke, deficits are not inherently harmful and can actually be a positive thing, especially during an economic downturn. For example, when the 2008 financial crisis caused an economic recession, large government spending via the $787 billion fiscal stimulus bill greatly benefited the economy. However, government spending can cause inflation. Inflation occurs when prices rise over time as a result of too much money being put into circulation, which in turn devalues of currency. If the government circulates too much money, it runs the risk of reducing the worth of money and causing inflation. The government can get around this risk, however, by raising taxes. Higher taxes can help keep inflation in check, while government spending on things like jobs and infrastructure can boost the economy. A job guarantee, which fixes the price of labor, can also prevent the risk of inflation. When it comes to government spending, monitoring inflation is more important than managing deficit. The national debt. In 2016, the United States national debt was over $13 trillion. However, a large national debt does not actually pose a threat to the American economy. Although politicians often use national debt as an excuse to cut government spending, debt is not always a bad thing. The national debt is not like credit card debt, which has to be paid down. Government debt is actually a record of the amount of U.S. Treasury bonds or securities that have been sold to raise money. Rather than accruing interest, these securities are circulating in the private sector, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, paying down the national debt can actually cause an economic recession. The crowding out theory. The crowding out theory states that a government deficit is bad for the economy because it takes money from the private sector to make up the deficit, which slows economic growth. However, this theory is a myth. Government deficits actually contribute to our collective wealth. According to the myth, the government sells bonds to investors in order to cover the cost of the deficit. This means the money these investors would have invested in new business enterprises is now tied up in high-interest securities, which slows the economy's growth. However, this is not how government taxing and spending works. Instead, it is more like there are two separate money supplies, one for the government and one for everyone in the private sector. Taxing and spending moves money between these two separate groups. If the government's budget is completely balanced, spending and taxes must be completely equal, which leaves no extra money in the private sector. A deficit, however, allows the government spending to put extra money back into the private sector, and only takes part of it back through taxes. This generates wealth in the economy. Deficit spending can be a good thing, but it is also the government's job to ensure that the spending equally benefits all parts of the economy, not just the wealthy or specific sectors of society. Spending on universally beneficial programs like healthcare or education, which benefit everyone in society, will help raise economic wealth for all. Funding entitlement programs. Social programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which are designed to protect certain segments of the population, are also called entitlements because these are benefits that citizens are entitled to. However, many fiscal conservatives, such as Republican Congressman Paul Ryan, want to eliminate or privatize these programs because they claim they are too costly. However, these entitlement programs are sustainable if the government chooses to make enough money to pay for them. According to Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, there is nothing fundamentally prohibiting the government from creating enough U.S. currency to cover the cost of these programs. These programs are currently limited only by politics and the constraints of tax revenues. Entitlements are funded by taxes, so if tax revenues decrease or the cost of the programs go up, it can be difficult to meet their payments. However, the government can get around these constraints simply by detaching the funding of these programs from tax revenues and committing to making enough money to cover these payments no matter what. Funding these programs also require certain material resources, such as money for hospitals and doctors to support Medicare for all. These come from a strong, productive economy, but spending money on these programs can actually benefit the economy by improving the lives of everyday citizens and helping curb inflation. The trade deficit. The United States has a trade deficit, which means that it imports more into the country than it exports. This means that the United States is spending more money on goods from abroad than they are spending on goods that are made domestically. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that the United States is losing the trade war. International trade is a good thing, even if domestic industries might be losing income to industries abroad, because it means that goods and resources are also being brought into the country. When people import goods from abroad, they can move money from domestic industries to foreign ones, which can cause unemployment in these industries. If the country begins exporting more than it imports, the money will return to the domestic well. However, this goal is traditionally achieved by policies that can harm workers' quality of life, such as reducing labor costs and cutting regulations. Instead, the risk of unemployment caused by a trade deficit could be mitigated with a federal job guarantee. Under this guarantee, the federal government would add money to the domestic sphere, which keeps the economy strong and helps the domestic industry be competitive with international trade, even if the trade deficit continues. Refocusing government priorities to more pressing deficits. The government's budget deficit is a big political talking point. Democrats and Republicans both prioritize the budget deficit, but there are more important matters politicians should be focusing on. There are other deficiencies in the real world that are more pressing than the budget deficit. For example, there is a jobs deficit that has been growing since 2008, which means that large parts of the country are still suffering from high unemployment rates. Where jobs do exist, they often do not pay enough to support most families. Since the 1970s, the average American worker's real salary has only increased by 3%. Unemployment and underemployment have caused a national savings deficit, which means that most Americans suffer from financial insecurity. Around 77% of Americans do not have enough money saved to comfortably retire, and 200 million Americans have no retirement savings. The United States also suffers from a healthcare deficit, which means that many Americans do not have health insurance, nor do they have enough money saved up to handle an unexpected health crisis. As a result, American life expectancy has dropped, and health issues have risen, particularly for the country's poorest people. Other examples of detrimental deficits in America include an educational opportunity deficit, an infrastructure deficit, and a climate change plan deficit, all of which should be addressed before the budget deficit. How the modern monetary theory can help. According to the modern monetary theory, the economy can be run the same way President Kennedy ran his plan to put a man on the moon. Putting a man on the moon cost nearly $10 billion, but President Kennedy focused on achieving the goal rather than worrying about the cost. Similarly, modern monetary theory focuses on running an economy in a way that directs resources to achieve specific goals and outcomes, rather than focusing primarily on the cost. This approach enables the United States to focus on solving bigger societal problems, such as instituting a federal job guarantee, which enables people to work and can reduce poverty, improve infrastructure, and strengthen the economy. This approach could also help reduce the negative impacts of climate change by empowering the government to buy up outdated and harmful infrastructure to make room for modern, renewable energy industries. The government could also choose to fund green research and implement green technologies. The modern monetary theory approach enables the government to redirect material resources to solve real-world problems, rather than focusing solely on government spending, balancing the budget, or reducing the deficit. The main takeaway: the federal government does not have to manage its budget the same way a typical household does. According to modern monetary theory, the government is capable of making and circulating currency, so it is not constrained by costs. It is only constrained by inflation, the productivity of the economy, and political goals and visions. The national debt, trade deficits, and government spending are not inherently negative. By using the modern monetary theory approach instead of striving for the goal of a balanced budget, governments can choose to redirect their material resources to solve real-world deficits, including the jobs deficit, education deficit, healthcare deficit, and climate change deficit.
Hi, I'm Rhonda, and this is an exclusive audiobook video recorded for the Audiobook Master Channel. Enjoy your audiobook and have fun learning. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button so you'll get updated on our next upload. If you liked the video, give us a thumbs up and say your thoughts about the book we just covered. Do you want to listen to a summary or review of a book that we haven't covered in the past? Say it in the comments below or send us a message. Don't forget to check our other uploads. Enjoy listening!